Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sue Juder. I'm the marketing specialist here at Business Machine Technologies. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. For the next hour, we are going to dive in and talk about the latest in cyber insurance. As most of you probably know, cyber attacks have grown in numbers and sophistication over the past years. This has led to an uptick in the demand for cyber insurance, so companies are able to better protect themselves. Today, we're going to cover the basics. We'll discuss what's covered under a typical policy, what security measures are needed in order to attain coverage, and what you need to do to obtain the best rates for cyber insurance. I'm joined today by John Reith from DataStream, a leading cyber insurance broker, and my colleague, Victor Tawari, who's the head of technical services at BMT. So with that, I'm going to turn the deck over to John. He's going to continue with the introductions and then dive into today's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. Hey, everybody, and thank you for joining. As Sue mentioned, my name is John Reith. I work for DataStream Cyber Insurance. I am both a partner success manager as well as a licensed insurance agent, and work with folks like BMT to basically offer a holistic approach to a cybersecurity program and help incorporate the cyber insurance arm basically into a cybersecurity program for a company. And happy to kind of tackle this subject here with the rest of the BMT team today. For any questions, don't hesitate to drop them in the chat as we're going through. I always like to leave a nice chunk of time at the end for us to go through Q&A. So we'll definitely answer everybody's questions that you have, but hopefully we'll also maybe answer a couple of your questions here today as we go through them. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first thing we're going to talk around is just the overall threat that the smaller and medium-sized businesses are facing nowadays. I don't think it's necessarily a huge shock and surprise to anybody that the amount of attacks has increased, but it might shock some people to learn about for those attacks that are succeeding against the SMB space. About 25% of those companies end up having to file for bankruptcy. It's not necessarily a surprise because we can see right above that the average cost for a data breach with companies under 500 employees is still almost 3 million. And we will, as we continue to move forward, you'll really start to see how that number isn't quite so crazy high as it might seem for an SMB. These incidents can get very messy very quickly. Unfortunately, the SMB space is often a very easy target. Smaller and medium-sized businesses haven't necessarily invested a whole lot in cybersecurity as of, up until maybe recent years. And as a result, 58% believe they're also still unlikely to be targeted by a cyber criminal. But we did just see the numbers, and that's no longer the case, right? Cyber criminals are targeting SMBs. And who is the most targeted? These are actually the top 10 most targeted industries. This is pulled straight off of the Verizon DBIR from 2022. It's a report that Verizon comes out with every year around data breaches. And so you're seeing right at the top, we have the professional industry. We have the public sector right after that, followed closely behind your finance companies, the information companies, so anybody that's really collecting a lot of information, manufacturing and moving on down gives you an idea of some of these industries that are being targeted. And this is in order, starting from one and kind of moving down the list there. But Victor may have even, maybe able to even talk around how small businesses, is this something that you have seen as far as small businesses and how they treat cybersecurity?
So what we've seen is not all small businesses. Some small businesses are actually investing the proper time and resources into having a proper program, but there are others that are under the mindset that I'm too small, a hacker's not looking at me, I have nothing of value to them. But the reality is those companies are the low-hanging fruit. Those are the ones that the hackers are counting on, on them not investing properly, on them not having the proper safeguards in place. And so we are running across that more than more than expected.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been a real change, from necessarily, I mean, even once upon a time, it used to be a lot more really trying to force your way into, bigger companies with, bigger pocketbooks and things like that. Whereas nowadays, you see more and more of these bad actors, right? It's more about just going around and checking doorknobs, right? And seeing what's open. And because if they can hit, 100 small guys at, maybe not as much as they would hit a bigger one, but they can hit more of them, right? For less time often. And here's a couple examples. We all hear about the big guys that get hit, but there's plenty of little guys too out there that are getting hit as well. It's plenty of medium and small guys. So I always like to pop this guy up just to give you guys some examples of what those numbers can really look like for people, and really it's not some mystery, right? There are real companies out there that are constantly getting hit. But why are they being targeted? I don't think any of these will necessarily be a huge surprise for people. Number one is obviously probably the most obvious. You have money. All right, that's the big one, right? We want to get in, get your money, get out. But number two and three are ones that maybe some of you haven't necessarily thought about is secrets to reveal. That also just means sensitive information, right? So that could just mean like personal records, like PII, right? Personal records for consumers, things of that nature, or HIPAA, right? Things of that nature, where you can't let these records get out because they're sensitive. Or number three down there is you can't afford to be down, right? Number two and three are often closely associated with a ransomware attack, right? If somebody can get in and lock you up and you need to be, up and running almost 24/7, they can hold that for ransom, right? We're not going to let you free unless you pay up, right? And so every moment that ticks by is, costs you as well as costs your reputation. And then, of course, if you have sensitive information, they can get in, lock that up, and keep that from you, or threaten to release it to the public, right? Which is what people will get hit with if you have, a lot of PII, you got credit card information, that kind of stuff that you're storing. They could capture that, threaten to release it to the public, which hits you with PII fines, right? So how do we fix this problem, right? How do we tackle the cyber risk that exists out there as an SMB? And I think it's the same as any other risk, right? We're big fans, you can see here, of kind of comparing it to the risk of fire. If you're a small and medium business, you still have that risk of fire, right? You, number one, invest in your own resources, right? You have fire alarms, you have fire extinguishers, maybe even sprinklers in your building that are ultimately going to reduce both the frequency and severity of a potential incident. But then that's still, I am sure, balanced by the taxes you pay in, right, for that fire department that has the fire truck, and maybe even also invest in your own fire insurance, right? So balancing both the investment in your tools and technologies, your own resources, as well as those collective resources to really mitigate the tail end of that risk. And to kind of dive more into the tools and technologies, I'm going to toss the ball, so to speak, up in the air over to Victor to kind of walk you guys through, what does that look like as far as, using some of those tools and technologies to help reduce that risk? How do we actually reduce that risk?
Okay, so reducing the risk, the first point here is to invest in a cybersecurity program. So that's not just financial, but you also want to take some time and invest in it also, because you want to understand what the landscape looks like and what each of the tools or each best practice, how they apply. And then you'll want to put some basic controls in place. And some basic controls, we've all heard them before, right? You want to use MFA. What is MFA? MFA is having basically two factors to get into a system. So a perfect example is using your ATM card, right? You have your card, but you also have your PIN. So if you dropped your card on the floor and someone picked it up, they don't have your PIN, so they can't get into your bank account. The same holds true for your password. If you have your password on a sticky, or if your password gets hacked and someone gets a hold of it, if they don't have that PIN, that password serves no purpose to them. So you're still protected. So that's probably the best thing you can do to strengthen up your cybersecurity. Some of the other things you want to do is you want to have a strong password policy. You want it to have 8 characters, use special characters. You also want to make sure you're patching your systems consistently on a regular basis. Many years ago, the computer systems were all static. Now we're all connected to the internet, and every single program has their own update. Adobe has an update, Office has an update, Windows has an update, your VPN has an update, and they all need to play together because one vulnerability could lead into attack into another program. So you want to make sure you stay consistent and up to date in your patching. Another good technique is to have some strong spam filtering in place. This will prevent any suspicious email, any threatening email to even get into your system. So you sort of cut that off before it even enters. And then one thing a lot of people overlook is to have a security awareness training in place. So this is important because if that email does make it to your system, you want your users to be able to recognize that, no, the CEO doesn't need me to wire money. They'll be able to recognize those types of emails and not act on them. So those are some of the basic controls to put in place. Another thing you do want to consider is you want to have some type of incident response plan. Similar to having a plan in case there's a fire, right? If a fire happens in your building, call the fire department, walk to the nearest exit, no running, right? So you want to have something similar in place if you do get a hack, right? Who do you call, right? What plays do you run? Do you run left? Do you run right? Do you have the proper resources engaged? How fast, right? Do you notify your customers? You want to map out all those processes before having to actually think on the fly. And you don't want to have it in your head or in your IT person's head. You want to have a written plan, a checklist that you can just go down and go through it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? Like the importance too of having that as a hard copy, right? Having an incident response plan that is an actual hard copy, because if you do get in and your systems are all bricked up and your incident response plan is on your system, not exactly going to be super helpful, right?
Yeah,
so making sure
you'll miss something because you'll be in a panic. You'll not be in the calm state of mind, and you'll overlook a step. So having that checklist or some type of plan in place really helps coordinate the efforts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's so important. And so, just like Victor was talking about, that's really a great way of how to at least get those stepping stones for beginning your cybersecurity program, right? Really starting to develop a culture around cybersecurity in the workspace, getting those basic controls in place, right? And preparing, doing things like, cybersecurity awareness training, because still to this day, one of the most common reasons somebody gets in is going to be human error, right? We're humans; it's going to happen, and so making sure you're building that culture is so important, right? And making sure everybody understands what those dangerous emails look like, and then something like maybe a phishing software, because that helps to reduce the potential of that human error, right? It helps reduce those spam emails, and so your employees aren't the ones having to be that filter. You have one who can do that for you. So we've got, we use those tools and technologies, just like the metaphor, to cover as much of that risk as possible, right? To really try to reduce that severity, really try to reduce the frequency, but trying to cover, I like to imagine it as like a 100% bar of protection against risk. You can get up to 80, 85, maybe even 90% coverage, but you start to get to that tail and it becomes very, very expensive, very difficult, right? Because technology is technology and humans are humans. And so that's exactly why across the board, any other risks, that's exactly why insurance was created, right? Was to basically cover, let's create an investment, a pooled resource of coverage for that tail end of risk. And that's exactly why cyber insurance was also created, right? But there's a couple of ways cyber insurance has been covered in the past. So I always like to give a bit of an explanation for kind of where we started and where we are at now. And doing that actually does give us all the differences of these various policies that we have out there. So once upon a time, cyber actually did have some coverage in your general liability policy. However, this is no longer the case. Okay, really want to make that very clear. In about 2014, the carriers all started putting very clear language inside of their policies, to really make a clear cut about no longer covering cyber. And then you do have some riders, but those are often very limited in their coverage, and I haven't seen too many that get over 100,000 in coverage, and we saw 3 million being an average. So we highly recommend a million in coverage being the basics to start from. So E&O is then going to be the coverage that actually protects you from yourself, right? So that's going to protect you from things that, mess ups that you have, whereas cyber liability is designed to protect you and bring you back after somebody else attacks you, right? A third party, somebody else came in and attacked you. So, but what does that mean? What does it actually cover, right? So cyber insurance, a standalone policy, right? Not one of those riders on the general, but a standalone cyber liability policy is actually very broad. It's going to cover, of course, your main data breaches, right? Including the breach response and remediation. That's going to include your legal fees. That's going to include any of the IT forensics teams that needs to be brought in, press release teams, any of these teams that need to be brought in to help you get back to speed. That's going to be covered there. Your business interruption is one of the biggest kind of portions of here, and often why the biggest factor that's taken into consideration when you apply for insurance is going to be your annual revenue, because they're actually going to cover the loss of your revenue when you're down during that cyber attack. And so it's going to cover not only the loss of that revenue, but also the salary of your employees, even overtime for those guys as you're getting back up to speed, right? And then cyber extortion, the last one down there. You heard me chat briefly about ransomware in the past. That's exactly what cyber extortion is. So it's not only going to cover your ransom itself, but also, again, any of the legal advice that you're going to need for working through that ransom. IT forensics is all covered. All of that is going to be covered under a cyber policy, right? So a standalone is actually quite broad nowadays. But what is the current state of the cyber insurance market? So we've seen, kind of what that, where we've come from, but where are we now? What we're starting to see is basically a tiered system form, right? Where you have kind of your best top tiered carriers that are going to offer you the best policy in terms of coverage at the best price, in terms of deductibles and premiums and all of that good stuff. So you have these kind of upper echelon guys, but those guys are also going to have more of your technological requirements. So they are going to be the ones who are going to ask to see things like MFA, maybe an EDR, things of that nature. While the others that don't necessarily have those requirements, they might not necessarily have, great coverage as far as like total, might not be $1 million in coverage, or it might be, really high premiums, really high deductibles, or might not be a pay on behalf policy, which a pay on behalf policy I talk about here on the next slide is just basically it means it's a policy where the carrier is going to pay upfront on your behalf as opposed to reimbursing you at a later date, right? So if you get hit with ransomware, some of these guys that aren't necessarily top tier don't have a pay on behalf policy for ransomware. So it means you have to come up with that ransom sum up front, and then they'll pay you back at a later date, right? So we often encourage getting into a pay on behalf policy so that they're going to get you that money right up front. And then as far as kind of the other cost factors that are involved in a good cyber policy, what we like to see are around of course, the premiums and the deductibles, right? So for a premium, and again, you've heard me say it a couple times, but we highly recommend $1 million in coverage being the best, As far as a premium for your typical SMB, it's still not extraordinarily expensive. It's going to be around $1,500, maybe $4,000 annually per million, right? And then the deductible is another one to look at, because some of these carriers might not have an extraordinarily high premium, but they're a bit sneaky, get away with having a really high deductible. And we like to see a deductible for a $1 million policy at around 2,500, maybe hitting that 10,000, just depending on the industry, but definitely not up into the $25,000, $40,000 range, which we've seen some policies get into there. That just gives you an idea of kind of what the current state is. So, if we wanted to get into those top tier policies, what does that look like? You heard me mention some of these technological requirements that you might come across. Well, these are going to be your most common ones here. Number one is going to be some sort of offsite or cloud backup. This is pretty much a universal requirement across the board. There's actually that kind of tiered system isn't necessarily a factor with this one. This one is pretty much all the carriers across the board are requiring this guy. Number two is where we start to get into the tiered system, where MFA is going to be required by those top brass guys, your gold star carriers there. Whereas you can move down to guys that don't necessarily require it, but as you can see here, those are typically 8 to 10% more expensive in premium costs, those guys that do not require MFA. Number three here is going to be, an endpoint detection or response, something that's, basically watching your endpoints, and that's going to be very particular, specifically for mid-market customers, and some of the higher risk industries do have that. Employee awareness training is similar in that way as well, where it is dependent on your size as well as your industry. Those two factors are two of the biggest factors when any carrier is considering you for a cyber policy, because of course each industry has its own defined risk, and then your size is, we just saw business interruption as one of the main coverages, and so they want to know your annual revenue size, right? And so that's what's affected here. But want to pass the ball to Victor to take you through some of these controls that we're talking about here as requirements, and just give you a little bit more insight into what they do and what they're all about.
Okay, thank you. So offsite cloud backups is actually a requirement that most businesses should practice now outside of cyber insurance. It's something that should be in place for disaster recovery, and even so it's basically exactly what it says: offsite backup. 10 years ago, we were taking a tape and putting it in a safe deposit box. Now everything is all connected, so it goes to a cloud, it goes to Azure, it goes to AWS. But you also don't want to take those things for granted, that they're just working. You want to make sure that someone is watching the house, that this process is happening and happening on your schedule. Multi-factor, we touched on it a little bit. You want to make sure you have that protection in place. You want to have that PIN. You want to have that app on your phone or whatever you're using to have that second authentication. Endpoint detection and response. Endpoint detection response typically goes with another product that is referred to as advanced threat protection. And so that's basically your antivirus on steroids. So at that point, it's looking for behaviors, right? If you always come into your system and you log on and you only access one server all the time, every day you come in and you access that one server, and then on Thursday you come in and you're accessing 7 different servers, it's going to say, no, something's wrong. Let me stop this, right? So that's what the advanced threat protection is going to do. The EDR is going to allow you to see where that threat came in and to track it down. And the cyber awareness training is something we touched on earlier also.
Yeah, just the again, right? Like the human error, it comes into play every time. So But so we've talked a bit about insurance and those requirements. It leads very nicely into ensuring, okay, let's go ahead and get insurance. You've decided you want to get it, but how do you make sure you're set up for success so that you're not getting any claims denied? And that ties right into those requirements, because the most likely reason that a claim is denied today is because somebody wasn't doing what they attested to doing at the time of applying, right? It's something we've seen very common, and it's often a question I get, like, isn't cyber insurance, finicky, only pays out, or very specific reasons, whereas 85% of the time, dig deeper with those guys, and it's because they said, yeah, oh yeah, we got MFA, we got some EDR going on, for sure, we have it all set up, and maybe even they did. It's possible that maybe they did, but along the lines, things happen. Humans are humans, and they get tired of utilizing MFA, which is understandable. I get it. But it goes by the wayside, right? Maybe 6 months in, or what have you. And then comes the day the claim is going to be filed. Of course, the carrier is going to want to dig in and make sure that, okay, you said you were doing all these things. Well, let's make sure you were actually doing those things. So keeping good records, actually having those things in place are all really important and can be very easily managed, and often we highly encourage managed by some external IT consultant, right? As opposed to necessarily handling all yourselves. There's actually tools now that will keep track of having these things in place and keep good records for you, really help simplify that whole process. So want to make sure you're definitely set up for success. So we've had a nice discussion here today, kind of gave you guys a bit of an idea of what the overview of what insurance looks like today, give you an idea of what some of those requirements are. But going forward, always like to give you guys, some things that you can do, how should you navigate this going forward? What should I take away today? Something actionable that you can do today, right? And two, these are kind of broader aspects of it. We'll dig into them each. Number one, obviously, is getting the cybersecurity house in order, right? It's something we've been talking about this whole time, but really starting to take it seriously, right? And taking cybersecurity as no longer a nice thing to have, but it's truly a need, right? For the SMB space. The world has changed, and I often like to say, just ask yourself if you feel like, is more or less of the world going forward going to be continuing to move into the cyberspace? Are we going to get more cyber focused or less cyber focused going forward? Because from what we've seen in the past, we're not going backwards, right? We're moving more and more into the cyberspace. More of our businesses are handled in the cyberspace. And of course, that's going to mean more bad actors out there who can see the opportunities to go and take advantage. So things have changed, taking these things into consideration and really starting to build a culture around cybersecurity is the path forward. And then ideally doing that with high quality advice. Work with experts. It's a complicated world. The cyber world is a complicated world, and you guys are focused on running a business, right? Get the idea, get the processes and procedures in place to understand the basics, but lean on a true expert in the space who knows what they're doing, right? Lean on an external IT consultant like BMT, lean on somebody like Data Stream Insurance. It doesn't even have to be us. I'm just saying it's going to save you money in the long run to lean on the experts in the cyber world as opposed to trying to learn and do it yourself. Just an example right here, at least from the data stream side of things, right now there's a lot of carriers out there who are kind of all over the place. So some companies are getting stuck with really expensive premiums when there's plenty of carriers out there who have really strong policies at perfectly reasonable premiums. So you can see just a couple of examples here how just reaching out to an expert and working with an expert can save you some cash, sometimes quite a bit of cash, sometimes almost half of their premiums, 15, 11,000, a year annually, right? Just by reaching out to somebody who has that insight into the space, right? And number two, getting that cybersecurity house in order. We have a first step that you guys can take right here today. We here at DataStream offer a free, basically, insurance readiness scan. It's the exact same scan that any of these carriers are actually going to run on your domain when you apply for insurance. It's an external domain scan that maps out basically your domain and your network and highlights any potential vulnerabilities and open risky ports that would basically show up as a red flag to insurance carriers. So it's a great kind of starting point. If you're interested at all in having one of these free scans done, just go ahead and drop your domain right here in the chat, and I'll be able to get one of those done for you. And me and Victor will reach out and set up a meeting to review. But it's a great spot to kind of start from, because not only does it give you an idea of kind of what your current network looks like and how that would look to an insurance carrier, but it gives you a starting point to work with an expert and let them know, okay, hey, let's go ahead and start fixing some of these things, right? We actually have a starting point, and just like G.I. Joe said, knowing is half the battle. So don't hesitate to drop that in. But that's pretty much going to bring us to our wrap up. We're going to move into questions and answers, and I'll pass the ball back to Sue.